right, everybody. Welcome to this month's Investing in Identity Forum. My name is Travis Dritt. I'm the founder CEO of Liminal, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we get started, just a quick introduction to Liminal. For those that don't know us, we're a boutique strategy firm focused squarely on digital identity, fintech, and cybersecurity. And we do a few things. We focus mostly on advisory services, market intelligence, go-to-market, growth strategy, transaction services, as well as research and other industry engagement items. You can learn more about us at liminal.co. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into it. I want to introduce the common cast and crew: Cameron D'Ambrosi, Managing Director here at Liminal, and Dave Fields, Partner at PTB Ventures. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. Please note all hairstyles are illustrative only.
Yeah. We probably should get some new photos. I mean,
welcome for 3.
Welcome back from the holidays. Did you guys do anything fun?
Dodged Omicron, hung out with the in-laws, wins all around.
I also dodged Omicron, Matt, while weaving through all of the bread lines that were out the door to get tested. That was fun, but yeah, here I'm healthy, all good.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you guys, both seemingly made it through the holidays. Well, let's go ahead and jump into it. So while we were obviously dodging Omicron, apparently, I think there were some notable deals. Last month, before the break in December, we wanted to cover, we had a shorter coverage of the deals and wanted to focus on some more of the predictions. So we have some deals here that actually ran in from the end of last year, but we're still seeing a lot of activity from the market right now. First is Stytch. And I know I'm going to probably turn this over to Cameron here in a second, but Stytch, passwordless startup, raising $90 million, Series B, valued at over $1 billion. I know a lot of people are talking about this. The Sift keyless acquisition, so the fraud prevention player Sift acquiring the authentication player keyless. We're going to be breaking down that deal a little bit more here in a second. Merit taking in $50 million in their Series B for digital credentials. Quite interestingly, I saw Experian Ventures on that one. I think that's a pretty interesting hat tip for Experian. The next one was 1Password taking in $620 million Series C. I found this one to be extremely exciting, given that I believe they credited a lot of this fundraise mostly to the rise of enterprise adoption from work from home. So password manager taking on big bucks, getting highly valued, seeing some of those celebrity investors back into that one. Next is Pinwheel, the API platform for income verification. I know this is one that here internally at Liminal, we're keeping a close eye on, taking about $50 million in for a Series B investment. And then lastly, 2 acquisitions. First, Plaid acquiring Cognito for $250 million and Twilio acquiring Boku for a little over $30 million. So lots of activity. Cameron, I'm going to toss over to you. General thoughts on any of these deals? I know we're going to break down the acquisitions here, but any of the fundraises, any sort of signals that you're starting to see in the market from this?
Yeah, I mean, look, what's the common thread among many of these is thinking about what is this world going to look like in a future where passwords are receding to the background. Stytch, obviously, tremendous heat and excitement around them. A unicorn with, as I understand it, a lot of buzz, a lot of developer interest. The commercials, I don't think are there yet, at least on paper. And then both Merit and 1Password, again, thinking about how we're going to be sharing attributes out into the digital identity ecosystem. I know there is much consternation in kind of the Mac universe around beloved, longtime stalwart of the password management space, 1Password, taking on all of this money and what that means for the future of the company. I think it's a very clear indication that they understand the road is nigh for being a password manager, and they need to get a foothold into the future of what authentication, what a passwordless future is going to look like. And that $620 million, a war chest that they're going to deploy to make sure that they have, a pot to play in, for lack of a better word, as passwords, don't exist. You can't be a password manager if nobody has a password. So really exciting stuff, and excited to keep our eye on them and how they deploy that dry powder.
Yeah, same question goes over to you, Dave. Lots of activity. I know we're going to break down the acquisitions here, but what's your general thought on some of these deals?
Well, look, I think, my counterpoint a little bit to Cameron would be, they are a password manager, right? And so the password manager is valued at almost 7 times the Passwordless startup, right? And so I get that there is an argument for a reduction in reliance on passwords, but I think that's a slightly more nuanced take than saying we're going passwordless, right? And actually, like, 1Password has an incredible installed credential base, which do leverage passwords, by the way. Although obviously then how you authenticate into 1Password, I suspect in many of these enterprises, they're using 2FA, potentially YubiKeys. It's much easier to deploy those sorts of things in an enterprise workforce environment. So it is interesting, right? That 1Password was a beloved password manager. I think was a consumer product that's now gone more and more enterprise. But I think I think what this says to me is that it's actually going to be really hard, if not impossible, to rip passwords out of the identity architecture that exists today. And so it represents an iteration in how we use them and our reliance upon them, rather than the fact that it's just going to disappear entirely, right? So I would just add that kind of like bit of nuance. But by and large, so again, we see huge, very large raises, $620 million. I think that's the largest raise we saw last year, or would have been larger than anything we saw last year. I assume this closed in 2021 and they just announced it recently. But that would be the biggest round. And so you just look at the round size, like the valuations and the round sizes, they're just all going in the same direction. So it'll be interesting to look back at these 3 to 5 years and see, which ones were actually the good rounds, because they're not all going to work out. I think a lot of them will, but not all of them.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I was just recently on a call with a very large consumer cybersecurity business. We're talking about passwords, and we're talking about what is going to drive adoption for consumer digital identity, and what kind of some of those solution segments. And I think password managers is the existing successful solution segment on our landscape that's going to be driving. It's going to be the bridge, regardless.
Yeah.
To reusable identity, or even just consumer digital identity schemes. So, and also, if anyone at 1Password is listening to this, my wife still complains that she's locked out of her account. I can't get her to actually get a new password manager, because that one time 1Password 4 years ago locked her out. But we'll move on from that one. And also, I think one of the things that you mentioned there, Dave, that's quite interesting is all the deals are still moving in this direction of becoming more expensive. And I think what we're starting to also see is a lot of these incumbent businesses that have, for the most part, relied on inorganic growth strategies are now reevaluating that, right? They're saying, hey, we either need to have an organic growth strategy where we're investing in product and innovation, which means we need to be doing recruiting. So you're going to be seeing a lot of brand refreshes, a lot of recruiting action out in the market. It's very, very difficult right now to recruit against some of these unicorns like Secure that are able to bring on some of the best talent in the industry. And as a result, I'm forecasting that we're going to start to see some other ways for innovation, whether these be through incubators or through accelerator programs or something else that we're going to see, where the incumbents can still have some form of inorganic growth that does not necessarily rely just on acquisition. So it's going to be quite interesting. So let's go ahead and move on. I know we want to cover three acquisitions today. The first being Sift and Keyless. So maybe we'll toss it over to Dave. You can kind of talk a little bit about it, and then Cameron, give us some more thoughts on Keyless, as I know you're familiar with the business.
Yeah, so Sift is really in the sort of online fraud detection and e-commerce. They're heavily involved in payments and the checkout experience for digital commerce. So what I found really interesting about that is to see them moving into multi-factor authentication, which so there's this, I think we've talked about this. This was a common theme all last year, was the blurring distinction in product categories. And then also companies that were addressing specific industry verticals, moving into other industry verticals, right? So now we have a very clear example of that, where somebody who was not previously part of like logging into your account, but that's not typically where we thought of Sift sitting, is now clearly moving into that space. I think one of the key themes for me when I look at M&A, and I know I made this comment in one of the previous webinars, but talked about, can you create, is a network effect something that you can create sort of post hoc through acquisitions? And like, who does it make sense to be the acquirer? And so Sift is an example of a company which clearly has a data network effect because of where they sit. And now we're seeing them move into other categories and potentially leverage that sort of data asset that they're sitting on to create sort of, product innovation in other categories. And part of that is going to be through M&A that they can then use to, bolt on, we'll see what the integration looks like, but it's a very interesting acquisition. It's not one that I have a strong like view on from a like, yes, this is going to work or not, but is an example of something that like, I think we kind of all said we would see. And I think it's worth calling out.
Yeah, I think it portends Sift wanting to build a closer and potentially more direct relationship with their customer base, right? If you think about how consumers are interacting with Sift now, you don't know that they exist, right? They're partnering with e-commerce platforms and their other customers to establish, trust and safety, score those identities as they're moving through these ecosystems. But the whole point of their platform is that you as a consumer never really know about it. It's all passive. And that's a lot of the value, is that zero friction layer. So I think that's a common thread with Keyless, right? Keyless looking for as low friction as possible, zero trust multi-factor. But in thinking about where those solutions are in market for Keyless right now, whether it's passwordless single sign-on or whether it is their PSD2 SCA solution, I think both of those things illustrate that Sift is probably considering moving much more closely into this customer identity and access management piece, or maybe looking about facilitating payments themselves, maybe moving into BNPL, for example. So I think it's really exciting and portends, again, a big shift in how Sift is going to market and that level of direct touch they want to have with their customers, leveraging that tremendous amount of identities they're already seeing, and maybe bringing them to the fore to extract more value from them.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. I mean, I think that's a really good point on many points on this one. I think that should be interesting to see what Sift does this year. We covered Sift a few times over the course of 21. Obviously, they have a new CEO in there. Jason Tan's moved to the chairman position. Obviously, expecting these guys to potentially make it to the public markets this year or in the near future. So interesting to keep an eye on this. If you look at the landscape, obviously we have them in the dominant solution segment of fraud prevention risk management, and then secondary for user-generated content moderation, and then they're acquiring the authentication, which is in that light green if you're watching on the webinar. Not a lot of congruent solution segments here, so I expect to see a little bit more activity across the landscape from these guys across over the next year here. Moving on to Plaid and Cognito. So maybe, Dave, do you want to kick us off again?
Yeah, I mean, Cognito, so a couple of interesting things about this deal. A lot of the M&A tends to fall into two buckets that we talked about last year, either sort of the Okta Auth Zero category where, it's a gangbuster, like, multi-billion-dollar acquisition price, or we don't disclose the acquisition price. This one was kind of like straddled, it didn't straddle the line, but which was, I think they announced it was a $250 million purchase price, right? So not always something we see announced. So Cognito was clearly doing pretty well. Shareholders, founders wanted it known that they were doing well when they sold. But here's one where we see Plaid, which sits squarely in the authorization domain, now moving up the stack into customer onboarding and identity verification, right? So it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, last year, identity verification was the blowout category that raised the most money, right? Like we saw multiple unicorns minted, ID.me, Secure, a whole bunch of others that were all doing this. And now we see Plaid moving into the space, a company which, has obviously attracted a lot of investor interest. I can't remember what their last valuation was. I think it was like 15 billion or something like that. But we see a company that is obviously going to be one of the biggest, most dominant fintech players. I think they've kind of cemented that, hey, they're going to be around. They're a player to watch. They're going to be in the public markets. IPO is their route at this point. And now in preparation for that, they're bolting on identity verification services. So, I think it's a deal worth calling out. And again, same themes that we were talking about all last year.
Yeah. Again, like thinking about a shift towards owning more of that consumer relationship. Right now, Plaid, certainly more of a consumer facing presence than a Sift, in the sense that, let's say you're, opening a fintech account and they're doing account verification via Plaid. There is a bit of a Plaid UX that you can hit. So you kind of have a vague understanding that you're interacting with the Plaid platform. But for the most part, Plaid has not really allowed consumers to interact directly in the sense of inserting themselves into something like the account opening process where they are controlling or creating an identity or account. And I think this Cognito acquisition signifies that they're looking to involve themselves more directly in those earlier stages of the customer lifecycle, whether it's through partnership with some of their bank and fintech partners, or maybe striking out on their own into new verticals. Again, options like BNPL immediately come to mind with where you might go with something like a Cognito. So really interesting. I think the multiple is good news for the folks we see out there still battling it out in the IDV space, and excited to kind of see where Plaid takes this.
Yeah. And just to my last kind of thoughts on this one to add is, we recently was chatting with a company, not in the identity space, but a company looking at, shoring up their business against any sort of payment and transaction fraud. And they were using Plaid for some of the payments, and they wanted to make sure that their system was safe. And they said, man, we wish Plaid actually had this identity verification capabilities rather than having a second vendor because it'd be too expensive. I'm assuming that conversation happens quite a bit with Plaid. And so for this bolt-on, this seems like a really nice add-on, a nice upsell opportunity for a lot of those sales reps over at Plaid. And I think this will do extremely well within their stack for existing customer bases. And if you can see here across the landscape, they added, obviously we don't cover a lot of fintech on the digital identity landscape here. We bucket a lot of that into the data aggregator side. But you can see the current position for Plaid being the dominant position in data aggregators, with the secondary positions in alternative credit, financial identity, and authentication, with the future position from Cognito coming in with KYC, IDB, and doc verification, proofing, fraud prevention, mobile identity, and biometrics. So adding a lot on the identity landscape itself makes Plaid a real contender across the board. All right, and let's go ahead and move to the last deal here, which is Twilio and Boku. So who wants to kind of kick this one up?
That's Cameron today.
Yeah, sure. This one is interesting in the sense that in some ways it is a bit of a strength on strength acquisition. Obviously, Twilio, fantastic market leader when it comes to the mobile identity and device intelligence market segment. Boku, we're a couple years out from the Denal transaction. I think, somewhat disappointed that they weren't able to make that synergy work more. A bit of air had come out of that balloon lately. And I think this is a sign that, maybe looking to retrench a little bit, sell off these assets to Twilio and see what they can do with the remains of that platform. On the Twilio side, I think this does portend a further penetration of Twilio into, again, the earlier parts of this customer lifecycle. Boku with some of the strength on the billing side, as well as some of these kind of autofill account opening capabilities where we have seen them be out in the market with a competitive product. I think we're going to expect to see Twilio continuing to identify what are the ways in which they can move out of that CPaaS, mobile identity stronghold into other areas of the life cycle, not just play a part in A2P messaging and SMS and other OTP factors with their Authia portfolio, and how can they forge a more extensive relationship, again, moving, laterally across that customer lifecycle, becoming stickier and extracting more value, because they have that critical touch point with, the end user's mobile device. And as we know, mobile only going to become more important, and the mobile device can be that anchor for continuing that persistence across account creation, the ongoing authentication, as well as potentially some identity and access management functions. So again, very excited to see where they take this next.
Yeah, it does seem that Twilio, I mean, you're seeing kind of a battle with Twilio, the Boku, of course, I mean, Telesign, Prove, Infobip, right? These mobile identity players looking at extending across, either doubling down into the authentication side or building a very strong platform in fraud prevention, risk management, right? And because they're so connected with the mobile device, I think you're going to end up with probably a real true trust platform, something that can really connect businesses to consumers in a pretty meaningful way, just like a lot of their products have already. For this acquisition, it makes sense to me that the Boku identity was sold, and it does make sense that it went to Twilio. I think this makes Twilio, it's a very clear signal to the market that Twilio is serious about this side of mobile identity versus, I think, what Twilio's what they're focused on right now around authentication and what people know them for. This acquisition, though, Boku bought Denal, which is really the initial creation for Boku identity back in December of 2019 for roughly 25 million in equities, plus a lot of incentives to bump it up to, very clear that this asset was, just trying to get it back off the books into another home where it could be successful. Overall, I think it's a good pickup for Twilio, makes a good signal, and it sounds like it was a good sell from a Boku side. All right. Yep. And then, great. And I know we're shortening these sessions quite a bit here. So, but I do want to bring up some of the things that we are working on at Liminal, including some of our latest research. And so if you haven't already, please take a look at some of the latest research that we published on consumer digital identity, including the consumer digital identity landscape of 2021, fixing the age assurance conundrum, and the life of pies, where we break down this concept of personal identity ecosystems. We'll be continuing to publish additional research throughout the year. If you have any research topics that you guys think that we should be digging into, feel free to reach out through our contact form. We're always interested in hearing your thoughts. And secondly, we've recently published several blog posts that we think might be interesting to this audience. The latest being our companies to watch list, where we listed out about 25 different companies that we see as really kind of key figures in the digital identity market for this year. So worth looking at, including 9 different startups in that list that we think are really representative of the landscape. And of course, this follows on our typical end of year, beginning of year tradition of seeing how we did in our past predictions, as well as our future predictions for the year 2022. And we have some other things to look forward to, including the 2022 Liminal Digital Identity Landscape. We'll be publishing that in the next couple of weeks here, as well as our research report on reusable digital identity market sizing. This will be the first time that we'll be going beyond just our research in the terms of a normal research report, and actually publishing an extensive market sizing report based off of how we view consumer digital identity and the concepts of reusable digital identity evolving over time. And lastly, we have our Liminal Summit coming up in early May. The Liminal Summit is 100 of the top executives and investors in the space. It'll be hosted in La Jolla, San Diego, the first week of May. And if you are interested in applying to come join us in La Jolla, you can do that directly on our website as well. And so with that, I want to thank my 2 common guests here, Dave and Cameron. Thanks for joining. Any last thoughts from you guys before we call it a wrap?
Forward to seeing everyone in La Jolla. It'll be nice to see some humans again after this latest quarantine bit.
Very well.
Yeah.
All right.
Seconded, who knows what special guests may appear.
Are you still pushing for Aaron Rodgers?
It's maybe slightly.
Even though he just lost in embarrassing fashion.
I mean, I think I would like to ask him about that in person, as well as his thoughts on the broader digital identity landscape.
Okay.
So you guys heard it applied for the Liminal Summit. Maybe you will meet Aaron Rodgers. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.